Hi folks, this is Russ Jones here to talk about the inferiority of secular morality, a response to Matt Dillahunty's presentation in which he claims the superiority of secular morality. There is a link right there for you to follow if you are interested in looking at Matt's presentation prior to my discussion, or you can listen to mine and then follow the link to his instead. Let's get to it. The order of my discussion is going to be a little bit different from Matt's. I'm going to try and start by laying a general framework under which we can discuss morality. This is important to me that we establish the same definitions and understanding so that we're not talking past one another. Then second, I will attempt to defend theistic ontology of moral realism against that of non-theistic. And finally, I will spend some time addressing some of the specific claims about morality which Matt Dillahunty made in his presentation. All right, for the general framework. First, what is the problem statement? I see three specific problems we might wish to address. The first is, how do we establish the truth of moral propositions? How do we affirm the truth of moral duties and obligations? And finally, are these best situated in a theistic or non-theistic framework? Now, I think it's also just as important here that I mention what I am not intending to speak about in this discussion. I don't intend to speak about how we know which moral propositions are true, which is a question of epistemology rather than ontology. I'm also not going to answer or attempt to answer how we know which moral duties and obligations are asked of us. Once again, it's a question of epistemological terminology. I'm not going to ask how we reconcile the behaviors in Scripture and of followers with theistic moral frameworks. This is certainly an interesting and important discussion to have. It's just not going to be part of this one. And finally, I'm not going to discuss whether atheists can behave morally. Of course they can. There are some ways in which they might not be able to behave morally if theistic frameworks prove to be true. For example, worshiping God is not a behavior under which an atheist would take, but for the most part, they absolutely can be moral. The important takeaways from this general framework is that no amount of discussion of moral epistemology can result in the establishment of a moral ontology. That is to say, we can talk until our face turns blue about how we know whether a certain moral proposition is true or whether or not we are obligated to do something, but that will not help us establish the foundation upon which these truths might rest. And finally, this is a discussion that assumes moral realism. That is to say that there are true propositions about morality, like it is wrong to torture kids for fun. There are plenty of non-theists who believe that there is no such thing as objective morality or moral realism, but that is for a different discussion. All right. So the first thing I like to do with any kind of discussion of this nature is to begin with definitions. The reason why I do this is so that we don't talk past one another. And you know what I mean when I am actually talking about a variety of subjects and use phrases that are idiosyncratic to philosophy. So, for the word truth or true, I'm talking about that which corresponds with reality. This is actually called the correspondence theory of truth. It is the most popular and accepted theory of truth among philosophers today, and commands the belief of more than twice as many of the next most popular, which is a deflationary theory of truth. I will not be going into these other theories, but will be following correspondence theory of truth because Matt himself, in at least one of his presentations, has claimed to be in line with the correspondence theory of truth. The second phrase you'll hear me use is moral worth, and I say that an object or being which is an end unto themselves That is, it is intrinsically valuable. It is something that has moral worth. This is important because things that have moral worth are not ends unto themselves. That is to say, that we are not to use them to accomplish our own goals. They are just as valuable themselves. I'll use the phrase moral values, and this is a list of general principles by which we relate our behavior between those with moral worth. That is to say, those with moral worth are deserving of things like justice, mercy, fairness, equality, love, and kindness. So when I use the term moral values, I'm talking about these general principles. Moral perceptions are how we perceive the interaction between competing moral values and their relation to the behaviors of beings with moral worth. For example, if you and I are looking outside a window and see one woman running after another woman, and the woman in the front has a bag, I might perceive that situation as the first woman has stolen the bag from the second and is running away from her, while you might perceive the opposite, that the woman in the front is the rightful owner of the bag and is being chased by a thief. It is important to note here that having different moral perceptions does not mean that there is no moral truth. In the same manner, just because I might guess or perceive that a tree is 40 feet tall and you might perceive that it is 50 feet tall does not mean that the tree does not have an objective height. By that same token, we might say here, or same principle, that differing moral perceptions does not negate the possibility of true moral propositions. So what is a moral proposition? It's a statement of moral values and their relation of beings of moral worth. So a moral proposition would be something of the sort that it is wrong to torture kids for fun. And it is the claim of the moral realist that these moral propositions can have truth values. Finally, there are moral duties. Moral duties are obligatory behaviors stemming from the relationship between moral values and beings of moral worth. This is to say that there is more than just the truth of the statement that it is wrong to torture kids for fun, but that you are obligated to not torture kids for fun. All right, so those are the definitions, and if you disagree with them, feel free to write in the comments why you think they might be different, but let's jump into this. So now let's compare some secular and non-secular explanations of moral theory. So we start with this correspondence theory of truth, the very first definition that I provide. The statement, "there is a computer on top of my desk," is true if and only if, in reality, there are things called computers, one of which is instantiated in the real world, and that has the property of being on top of a thing that is also existing in the real world, desks, which is instantiated and is possessed by me. So that's just a really convoluted way of saying that the truth of the statement, "there is a computer on top of my desk," is based on the fact that in reality there is a desk with a computer on it that is mine. But it's important to know that each part of the proposition has a referent in reality, or a truth maker. For example, if I were to say there's a computer on top of my flying spaghetti monster, unless flying spaghetti monster existed in reality, then that statement would be false, because one part of the sentence or one part of the proposition does not have a referent in reality. It does not have a truth maker. But this actually presents a problem for some of the most obvious truths that we know of. How do we affirm non-physical truths? For example, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Any attempt to refer to something in nature that would prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2 would in fact presuppose that 1 is a number and 1 is a number and 2 is a different number, and would presuppose the relations of addition and equaling. So it seems very difficult to affirm non-physical truths against the correspondence theory of truth. Similarly, we can say the same thing about basic logical truths. If A then B, A then B. It's the simplest formulation of an argument, but how exactly do we refer to something in nature that will actually show that this is true? Well, the way that people or philosophers have attempted to address this is numerous, but at least one of the methodologies is what's known as Platonism or Neoplatonism, which would state that, for example, mathematical objects are abstract objects. They are causally effete, meaning they do not cause anything. They don't stand in causal relations, but they are non-physical, immaterial, and some might say they exist necessarily. Well, this also presents a problem for moral statements, like it is wrong to torture children for fun. Certainly, the concepts of torture, children, and fun all have reference in reality. But wrongness, what is wrongness in reality? There isn't a physical entity that we could point to. Now, one could, for example, suppose that there are abstract objects or brute facts to which this refers, but we'll have to see if that is an acceptable explanation. So, affirming non-physical truths can be difficult. So, what are the referents? Affirming non-physical or moral truths is not as difficult on theism as it is on theism. So let's look at some of these non-physical moral truths or moral statements. So, moral worth. We can make the claim humans have moral worth. I think most realists of morality say that humans have moral worth, and most of us believe that we have some sorts of human rights, like we have the right to life and liberty. So, how do we affirm that humans have moral worth? On theism or on non-theism? Well, on theism, the explanation is that intrinsic value is situated in God himself, and that God has made humans in his image, and this imbues them with intrinsic value, and thus moral worth. So, when you ask, what is the referent to the statement humans have moral worth? On theism, that referent is God. But what about on non-theism? What gives us moral worth on non-theism? Do we somehow become morally worthwhile because we are conscious? Or do we become morally worthwhile because we have evolved social mores? And to what exactly would we be referring in that state? Sam Harris has quite famously stated that morality at least has something to do with consciousness. That is to say that a world without any consciousness would not have morality, because there would be no being that would be even capable of caring about being hurt or having goals. And I think he's right to a certain degree, but I don't believe that it is only related to consciousness. For example, if a conscious being becomes unconscious, we don't believe at that point they are no longer morally worthwhile. And we also think that individuals who are unconscious prior to birth have at least some amount of moral worth. Even individuals who are fully pro-choice would state that there are at least some types of things that it doesn't really matter whether or not you were born, that it would be morally abhorrent to do. So, for example, you could say that it would be morally abhorrent to remove a child or a baby from a pregnant mother and do certain types of experiments on that baby and then put it back into the mother to complete gestation. So I'm not quite sure that consciousness is really appropriate. Uh, it certainly has something to do with morality, but I don't believe that it alone can suffice as the referent for why things might have moral worth. And having social mores seems to be the same as well. We know that various animals have evolved a number of different types of social behaviors in order to maximize the likelihood of their survival. But because many of their behaviors are mutually exclusive with the ones that you and I would consider to be acceptable, like infanticide, then we can't really point to them as the ontology, or at least the foundation or referent for moral worth. But what about moral values? We could make the claim love is a moral value. So what are the referents in that statement? What is the referent that love is good? What is the referent to which we're pointing? Well, on theism, it's quite simple. God is goodness itself. Thus, the referent which the word goodness points to is the very nature of God. This would be the same as saying, what does it mean to be rocky? And you can point at a rock and say, that's what it means to be rocky. And when we say what is good, it means we can point at God in His very nature and say, that is what it means to be good. Now, you might say Scripture looks horrible and there are terrible things in it, but that would be a very different question about whether or not we can situate morality or moral values in God. Perhaps the Christian concept of God is completely false, and the concept under another religion might be right. But the ability of God to serve as a moral grounding for moral truths, as a foundational or ontological grounding for moral truths, seems plausible. But what about on non-theism? What's available to us? Well, philosophers have proposed a number of solutions. One is that there exist a number of brute Platonic objects or abstract objects that simply make these statements true. That is to say, there's somewhere floating in reality, well, not floating because it's not spatio-temporally located or anything. There are these objects, and these objects exist necessarily or contingently, but they at least exist, and they make the statement, love is good, for example, true. Others have attempted to embed it in nature itself, to say that there are emergent moral features. There is currently a professor, Weivenberg, who has a moral theory of this sort. But once again, it's very difficult in the sense that we can't really point to this referent. It's just that moral observations seem to tell us that certain things are good and certain things are not, and we don't have something physical in nature to point to. So once again, I raise the question, on non-theism, what is the referent? If we accept the correspondence theory of truth, what is the referent that makes moral values true? And what about moral duties? The statement, you must not torture kids for fun. Well, there's a simple analogy on theism to what makes not torturing kids for fun an acceptable moral duty. That is to say that moral duties arise from competent authorities' commands. So the only examples we have of duties and obligations in our lives come from individuals who are competent authorities. My boss tells me that I must fill out some form, or a police officer tells me to pull over, or a parent tells me to stop smacking. And often these are in a dependence relationship. As a child, I'm dependent upon my parent. As a citizen, I'm dependent upon the police officer for my protection, and as an employee, I'm dependent upon the boss for my sustenance, for pay. And similarly, on theism, there's a competent authority who gives us commands, and that competent authority is God. There is a dependence relationship, just like in all of these other situations. That dependence relationship is the radical contingency under which we exist. That is to say, without God, we would not exist at all. Not just be born, but we would no longer continue living. His sustaining will keeps us alive. There's also another very important point here to notice, which is when we use the word competent, what we're really talking about is having privileged access to certain information. For example, God has privileged access to what is right and wrong, and privileged access to all of the variables in any given context that would allow one to determine what are the correct possible responses to that context. Similarly, a boss is able to either make or at least is expected to know the responsibilities and goals of the company. A police officer has to take tests and to know the law, and the parent is competent insofar as he or she is allowed to make certain rules, and those rules he or she knows better than the child. Now, this is loose. There are certainly different authorities who have different levels of competency, but we could certainly say that if there is an authority who is incompetent, we would not have the obligation to follow their obligations, or at least their commands. A police officer, for example, who has never read the law, let's say that it's a police officer from a foreign country who doesn't know the laws of the United States, is not able to issue commands that are obligatory. But what about on non-theism? Can we find a similar type of analogy that works? On what basis? What is the referent that we would point to that would compel us or oblige us not to torture kids for fun? This is perhaps the most difficult part of answering the question of moral realism for non-theists. Who is this competent authority with which you are in a dependent relation that obligates you to follow true moral propositions? Is it society? Is society a competent authority? It seems not to be the case, given that two societies could have mutually exclusive belief sets. In fact, we see this all the time. We see that, for example, Nazi Germany had very, very different belief sets on what moral values are and what moral propositions are true, versus the members of the Allies in World War II. Can evolution somehow serve as a purpose, or serve as this competent authority? That is to say, we are obligated to do what evolution has compelled us to do. Evolution has provided us with certain deliverances of moral perceptions, and we are obligated to follow them. Once again, this seems to be problematic because evolution produces people with very different, in fact, mutually exclusive belief sets about how they are to proceed in life. And it is impossible, or at least I would argue that it is impossible to adjudicate between two individuals who have these different belief sets about what moral duties exist if both of those individuals claim that their referent for those duties that make them true is evolution, because both of them would appeal to the exact same provider. This makes it very, very difficult to find some kind of competent authority which we are in a dependent relationship to and thus must follow. It's just a fact that on non-theism it is almost impossible to situate exactly where moral duties exist. So, when judging theism versus non-theism, we can ask things like, what is the ontological explanatory power? Do do we see that theism furnishes an explanation of moral worth, moral values, and moral duties? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, you might think that these are wrong, these are incorrect. They are possibilities, and they are possibilities that are viable. What about non-theism? What we've seen are very weak at best explanations that seem to be ad hoc in nature. That is to say, we are coming up with an explanation for how moral values and moral duties are ontologically situated because we just have to. And so we just postulate that there is a referent that we can point to, like a brute fact or an abstract object, for which we have absolutely no other evidence of existence except for the fact that it seems that moral theory breaks down without it. Of course, God is not like that. There are many arguments for the existence of God, and while you might not agree with even one of them, at least there are other arguments. The arguments for the existence of brute facts about moral reality essentially consist of there are moral truths and we need a referent. So I don't think ontologically there are strong explanatory powerful reasons for accepting non-theism's explanations. Now what about simplicity? It seems to be the case as well. It is a very clear and explicit relationship between moral worth, moral values, and moral duties under theism. And on non-theism, we don't find that kind of simplicity. We find lots of different explanations and explanations that are frankly just feel like a stretch. The classic example would be for moral duties. It's pretty obvious to see the analogous relationship between our dependence upon God and why that might create in us certain duties, as with the fact that we are dependent upon our parents, and because of that relationship, it might present us with certain duties, like when they tell us to do our dishes, we should do our dishes. That kind of simplicity just doesn't exist in secular examples of moral theory. All right, so now that we've gone over some of these differences between how theists situate the ontology of moral worth, values, and duties, and how non-theism attempts to do so but appears to not be able to provide these foundations at nearly the same level of explanatory power and simplicity, I'd like to reply to some of the description and objections raised by Matt. Now, one of the really interesting things you're going to hear is that even though the name of this presentation by Matt is the superiority of the superiority of secular morality over non-secular morality, but even though that's the name of this discussion, he does not in any way, shape, or form describe what that foundation for truth is. He just doesn't. He rambles for about 30 minutes making a variety of claims about morality and secularism and lays into theism, but does not provide his own framework, which I think is telling that there just isn't a simple or easy way to explain morality on secularism in a 30-minute presentation. And so he stoops to other methodologies, more or less attacking theism. So let's start with some of these specific objections and descriptions. The first paraphrase from Matt Dillahunty is his statement that his smartest Christian family member told him to ask his friend where he gets his morals from in an attempt to convert him, and that he claimed that ultimately this question was, and I quote, stepping in manure. The inaccuracy of this statement is the belief that because a smart Christian said something inaccurate, non-secular morality is false. Obviously, anyone with any kind of philosophical training or, frankly, basic knowledge of logic would realize that these two things do not follow. In reality, Matt is right that that question is the wrong question. The question shouldn't be where he gets his morals from. But there's a very good related question, namely, what makes moral propositions and moral duties true on theism versus on non-theism, which is exactly what we went over. And were he to ask that question of his atheist friend, it would be interesting to see if the atheist could provide the proper referent demanded by the correspondence theory of truth that would show that moral propositions and moral duties are true. The next objection or description made by Matt is the paraphrase that theism offers an illusion of certainty and a comfort of simplicity. The inaccuracy here is that non-secular morality offers only certainty in a number of situations. Not always. Most non-secular adherents would not claim that the truth to moral propositions is certain or simple. Moreover, this is an issue of epistemology, how adherents know the truth of moral propositions, not whether they are actually true. And finally, and most interestingly, simplicity is actually an explanatory virtue. It is the statement of Occam's razor that we should not espouse unnecessary hypotheses. And so a simple hypothesis, like the existence of God, being able to satisfy all of the questions about moral worth, moral duties, and moral values, is actually a virtue of that explanation. So I'm not quite sure why he makes this claim here, because it is, for the most part, irrelevant to the discussion, and the part that is relevant to the discussion is patently false. The next description or objection that he makes is that you can build a secular moral system and list off 3 examples: that life is generally preferable to death, pleasure is generally preferable to pain, and health is generally preferable to sickness. The inaccuracy here is that it's not the theist's claim that non-theists cannot build a secular moral system. The claim is that there is no ontological foundation for that system. Interestingly enough, Matt undermines his own position in this very statement by using the word preferable over and over again. Preference is subjective, not objective. Of course, anyone can build their own moral code, but the truth of that moral code is not established simply by one asserting it. There must be a referent for it to be true on the correspondence theory of truth. So once again, I ask, where does Matt provide what the referents are which make moral values, moral propositions, moral worth, moral duties true? The next description or objection made by Matt is that it doesn't matter if morals are arbitrarily plucked out of nowhere, or intuitions if they are about emotions, but matters if they are useful and true. I agree. But once again, I ask the question, what is the referent what makes moral propositions true under a secular framework? I also want to point out here that this seems to be an attempted slight, that the theists just arbitrarily pluck these things out of nowhere, or they have intuitions that are emotional and those aren't justifications at all. I don't think that could be further from the case for the average theist. But let's move on. He next says we evaluate the consequences of our actions with respect to specific goals, and that is how we determine right and wrong. The inaccuracy here is Matt does not explain what those goals are and to what they refer in order to establish their truth. Once again, this theory of correspondence of truth is fundamental to establishing the truth of any statement, and Matt is utterly incapable of providing what the referents are that make all of his moral speak true. In reality, Hitler was very effective with respect to his goals. Now, I'm not saying that atheists are like Hitler in any way, shape, or form. I'm simply using it as an argument ad absurdum, the consequences of which included eradicating a large portion of the human population for what he perceived to be good purposes. The consequences of our actions with respect to goals is a good measure only if we establish the truth of what those goals ought to be in a moral sense. Matt has yet to establish this referent, which makes these goals and propositions true. Moving on, Matt says the truth of human interaction isn't contingent on a single mind. Matt asserts this under a non-secular moral framework. Moral values are contingent and upon the whim of God's mind. This is a straw man. Theistic frameworks for morality place the referent for moral values and propositions in the very nature of God. Remember earlier when I mentioned if you want to know what the word rocky means, you can point to a rock. In the same way, if you want to know what goodness is, you can point to God. We're not saying that you point to arbitrary contingent thoughts of God, which would be half of the Euthyphro dilemma. We're saying that it is his very nature. So God as a necessary being produces necessary outpourings of his nature, the commands and duties which we are supposed to follow. Matt then goes on to say, without God, it is all relative, is often a claim made by theists, but he says God's solution doesn't solve that either. Religion has no viable solution to this problem. Disagreement among faiths and churches and denominations are just as bad as disagreement among non-theists. Well, what Matt asserts here is that the disagreement among faiths makes non-secular moral reasoning no less muddled than secular moral reasoning. Here's the reality. Matt's secular moral framework has yet to establish a referent to establish the truth in the first place. We can't even get off the ground. We don't even have a standard with which to compare it. I'm not saying we don't know the standard. I'm saying that on non-theism, there is no standard. Not that we have trouble knowing. You see, to the theist, we might have trouble knowing the standard, but at least we admit that there is one. Within non-secular frameworks, theists can measure their actions against things like revelation. For example, people of different faiths might have different moral perceptions, but those perceptions can be weighed against the duties and obligations set out by God's commands, such as to love your neighbor as yourself. But in order to measure anything, we must first have an objective standard. This is true in all of science. If we didn't have standards like the meter or the liter, then how would we measure things like length or volume? We set standards, and those standards have to exist in order for us to measure. Matt then flippantly makes this remark, God said so, I'd agree, solve that one, as if he's some sort of genius. Theistic moral frameworks hold that God is goodness itself, thus Matt would be wrong. This would be akin to Matt saying, George says he likes flowers. I disagree that George likes flowers, solve that one. Well, obviously George is the authority on what George likes. This is just nonsense. I'm not even really sure why Matt, who is intelligent by all measures, seems to think that this is in some way a defeater of theistic formulations of moral reality. Then says, why do I care? Well, Matt seems to think that his psychological status regarding an issue establishes whether it's true. In reality, whether you care or not does not matter. In fact, this statement comes from atheists many times. They say the reality is that whether you believe in science or not, if you don't get out of the way of a speeding train, it's going to kill you. But this is the same thing true if you take same thing as if you take moral realism to be true. This is why theistic moral frameworks succeed where non-theistic frameworks fail. There is an objective standard, and you do have objective morals and duties, like not to torture kids for fun. You may not care, but it does not absolve you of your duties any more than not caring about the speed limit allows you to go 90 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Next, Matt Dillahunty paraphrases, the power of a secular moral system is that it is data-driven. It's not the data, but the use of the data matters. As you know, I'm a data scientist. You see, theists use data to determine whether attempts at, for example, loving their neighbors as themselves are succeeding. We can use data to accomplish any goal, moral or not. The problem here, once again, is that Matt has still not provided the referent that makes moral propositions true. And without that referent, you can't justify the goal as being moral. If you can't justify the goal as being moral, then being data-driven doesn't ensure that you are actually accomplishing anything moral. He then says, if you do it before evidence, you are a moron. I agree with this statement, but once again, this is intentionally uncharitable. Theists did not act without evidence and moral reasoning. This is just an unjustified insult, and that's better than this. He says that no absolutes is wrong. I agree. But within certain specific situations, there are a finite pool of actions that could be right or wrong, and we will never know if we accept someone's bald-faced lie assertions about what it is. So I agree, but I don't think that anyone is making, quote, bald-faced lie assertions, whatever exactly those are. Christians and theists alike, their moral frameworks are not blind assertions. They are reasoned. For example, as a Christian theist, I regularly think about how I should apply love thy neighbor as thyself in a given situation. From the simple things like always paying for the person behind me in the drive-thru to more involved decisions like making contributions to charities, we reason through how we might apply the values which are ontologically grounded in God himself. But I ask of Matt, if you have no ontological grounding, if you can't provide that referent which makes moral propositions true, then what exactly are you reasoning on? What set of axioms have you begun with against which you can reason? Then says, excuse me, we've already answered this question. So let's just jump to the concluding remarks. As we can see from Matt's discussion, he cannot and does not provide a referent for establishing the truth of moral worth, a referent for establishing the truth of moral values, or a referent for establishing the truth of moral duties. Given that Matt has stated that his understanding of truth is that which comports with reality, he is unable to provide an account of what comports with fundamental moral ontological questions. Even if every moral statement Matt says is true, he does not have the framework in place to justify the truth of that claim. On the contrary, theism offers a clear, simple pathway between our moral intuitions and their truth, in line with the correspondence theory of truth. Thus, we have a firm foundation upon which we build our moral lives. Let me conclude by saying this. Once again, it is not to say that atheists cannot live moral lives. They can. Many atheists are beautiful people who do wonderful things. The difficulty, though, lies in how they justify it. There's a reason why many of the greatest atheist thinkers of all time have come to believe in moral nihilism. But none of the greatest theist philosophers of all time have come to believe in moral nihilism. And it's because it is very difficult to establish this ontological foundation for morality without God. Thanks for taking your time.